So my first official article was about the elections board because I was a features writer, but all of my stories kept getting pushed, so they moved me to campus to see if I could write something, and it was USAC election season, so I wrote about some election board violation, something like that.
So it was a story about essential workers at UCLA, and the subject was this girl named Gabby, and she worked at Target, so it was just like a profile on her. And I remember I was really nervous because I am a very shy, introverted person.
After kind of a long process of going through different media representatives and things like that, I eventually landed with someone who was a labor leader, and his name was Enrique Rosas. He was a custodian on campus, and so I decided to accompany him on one of his shifts.
I didn't have journalism experience coming into UCLA. Didn't do any of that in high school or anything, so to be told to essentially go cover an event and then like take interviews and write up an article about it seemed very quick paced to me.
It happened during the pandemic, so it was my second year. I was at home. I'm from Hawaii, so like I felt very isolated from campus at the time, but I remember feeling good, like this interview was able to like bring me closer to people on campus, which I really appreciated.
My first published gallery, I think, was part of the COVID response with some photos of empty grocery stores.
I remember it was a preview for women's basketball because the other two people on the beat with me, Dylan D'Souza and Michael Waldman, took all the raps for like the first 5 or so games, and I was pretty mad at them that I had to write a preview for my first story.
I remember just having a lot of fun with it, even though I was really nervous, and like once I started writing, those nerves just disappeared.
I remember being very intimidated because I was just there with my little Canon Rebel T6 and my kit lens, and all these other people were there with these huge telephoto lenses and like these really intense cameras.
My first story was a Pro Bruin rundown, which is what a lot of sports interns write their first stories. Really boring, just kind of a content filler for sports.
I think it was just really nerve-wracking sending emails, like the anticipation of like pressing send. And then doing the interviews, I felt like I was just making stuff up. And then after that, like I was trying to write the article, and I didn't know how to write it, like at all.
Teddy, who was my editor at the time, had asked us to all meet with her one-on-one with pitches. So I walked to the office. It used to be very dark, a little moldy. I was kind of intimidated. And I went up and I had all these pitches and we went through them. And because it was my first time, none of them were that great. But she pulled out her own notebook of pitches and was like, hey, do you want to write this story on the Plato Society in Westwood?
Here is your article. Oh my gosh.
It's been a really long time. I probably haven't looked at this since it was published.
The lead is so dramatic.
There's a typo. There's like no space here.
I already noticed a mistake within the first 10 or so words.
Very standard news lead. You know, could be better, could be worse.
My first thought is that my photos of the softball players have definitely gotten better.
I remember the first draft, I had like 600 words about Loyola Marymount. Usually, if it's a bad team like that, you do just like a paragraph or two. And I remember my editor having to like sit with me and be like, you don't need to talk about them this much. Like one graph will do.
Honestly, the lead, I said Josh Rosen is traveling for the holidays because it was like December 28th, and I thought that was super funny. In retrospect, it's actually not very funny at all.
I think I'm pretty proud of like the fact that I wrote this like for my first article. Like I feel like some words like sound pretty good, but the rest maybe not.
Oh, this is cute. It's longer than I remember it being. And I think also I forgot how much of it was kind of centered as a love story. The story itself, it feels like a little nostalgic to me because it felt like very of the time. Like I wrote this in November 2020, like right before Thanksgiving, I think, and it was when like COVID cases were still pretty high, and like that's why this story is like very much focused on like how parents during the pandemic were like struggling or facing like unique challenges of raising their kids through the pandemic. And I feel like that story, it like is a little bit bittersweet, but at the same time I feel like it's a story that like I would probably never get to write again.
I think it's funny because it's, as I like kind of moved through DB, it's not a story I feel like I would have ended up publishing during my time as an editor, in part because it's a single source the entire way through.
It's like fun to read it back knowing that half of the stuff I wrote in there was changed up a lot because my first draft read like an essay rather than a DB article. But it's funny to think back now because writing DB articles last year as like news top became like second nature.
Every time I walked into the stores, they would tell me to stop taking photos. And at the time, I was kind of scared because I didn't really know media law as well. Now I know that they had no right to tell me to stop, like to do anything besides tell me to stop, but I was worried I would lose my photos.
Yeah, I would definitely say overall that it's like pretty boring, but like especially for a big win because they beat the number one team in the country in Stanford and then lost to the number 2 team. So I definitely think that I could have captured those emotions better.
I don't know, I think I remember having like 40 CQ links or something for this one because I was just trying to use like all stats. I remember just researching for like ages trying to find fun stats, and now 3 years later I realized that nobody really cares about those stats.
I think, yeah, definitely from my own experience, don't be discouraged if your first story or article maybe doesn't work out the way you intend it to. You could also try writing for different sections if you like find yourself in a bit of a rut.
Especially with your first story, you learn the most because you learn how to talk to people, you learn how to navigate this campus.
Take chances. All you need is one person to tell you yes. If you're trying to get access to a venue, if you're trying to get an interview from somebody, you just need a yes from one person.
It's totally okay to admit that you don't know what you're doing, but at the same time, you should have some level of confidence in yourself.
Do not be afraid, because I think everyone really wants you to be able to use your skills and gain more experience. No one is really judging you that hard, especially if you're an intern, you don't really know what you're doing. Ask questions, don't be afraid to bother your editor about things.
Everyone's nervous. It's totally fine to get nervous, whether you're nervous about interviewing or like whether your writing's even good. That's totally fine. But everyone learns after just trying, so I would say just go for it, and once you get in the process, once you get the creative juices flowing, then I promise you all those nerves will disappear.
Don't be afraid to listen to your gut feeling in journalism. I think that's something that has guided me a lot, and that's with writing, that's with pitching, that's with reporting. Like, I think as you do more stories and as you get really attuned to your beat and your niche, you're going to realize these times when you feel like you should push on something and times when you feel like you should draw back, and that's not really something anybody else can tell you to do or not do. So really, don't be afraid when you get that gut feeling, when you're like, I want to go for this story, I want to write this story, even if you feel like you might not initially have the most support. I would say don't shy away from that.